Final Fantasy XIV managed to ascend from a legendary failure to become a critically acclaimed MMORPG, a feat helped by the expanded free trial that allowed players to play through the entirety of A Realm Reborn. It wasn't until the award-winning expansion Heavensward that 14's image went from likable underdog to truly great video game. The addition of this expansion into the free trial and raising of its level cap to 60 is what finally pushed many players such as myself to play the game. While A Realm Reborn is fine enough on its own at providing a Final Fantasy world that players can explore with their friends, the promise of the praised Heavensward was always the carrot dangling on a stick to motivate players like me past the mediocrity. The patches leading into Heavensward put in a lot of work to build goodwill that Final Fantasy XIV was indeed going places, but the game's merit rode entirely on how well Heavensward was able to fulfill that promise. So, was it? The beginning of Heavensward is deeply tied to the finale of A Realm Reborn's patches. Let's give a quick recap, shall we? I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to say that the final hours leading up to Heavensward are packed with more plot developments, twists, and surprises than the entirety of A Realm Reborn. It's such a mind-blowing shake-up of the status quo that'd be fantastic in any story, but it's especially surprising in an MMO that requires a consistent living world shared by many players. The assassination of the Sultana of Ul'dah, betrayal of the Crystal Braves, and dissolution of the Scions of the Seventh Dawn all happened in a single sequence, a sequence that was a cliffhanger for anyone who was playing before the launch of Heavensward. I can only imagine the suspense I would have felt in the months between, but luckily for me, I didn't have to wait at all. Didn't have to wait to continue the story anyway. The answers and consequences of much of that finale are put off for the first half of Heavensward as the small party of remaining Scions are finally allowed entrance into the long closed off city of Ishgard. The player is accompanied only by Alphinaud and Tataru, with the mysterious Urianger choosing to stay at the Waking Sands. The urge to find the missing Scions and reveal the plot against the Sultana is strong, but the need to hold off on those payoffs until later in the story is understandable. Luckily, the simple act of learning Ishgardian politics and exploring the city is itself paying off mysteries established in A Realm Reborn. It was obvious that Ishgard was reclusive in order to have a clear choice of location for any expansions the game would get, but the chance to see the fabled city is still satisfying. The oppressive grey and towering architecture makes sure the player feels unwelcome. It's an effect that can make the expansion feel like a slog, since the city serves as the central hub for its entirety, but the presence of a surprising amount of warm, friendly characters prevents it from weighing the thing down too much. House de Fortemps replaces the Waking Sands and the Rising Stones as the player's base of operations, and the head of this house, Edmond de Fortemps, welcomes the Scions in a way uncharacteristic of Ishgardians. He's also the narrator in the expansion, an element to the story that A Realm Reborn did not have, perhaps for the better. This narration never adds much of anything that the scenery it's played over doesn't already convey. Perhaps the narration is an attempt to inject story in places it's largely absent from. Heavensward's first act takes its time acclimating the player to the new areas and characters in a series of quest chains that don't amount to much story-wise. Specifically, the player follows two quest chains, each following one of Edmond's sons, Artoirel and Emmanuelaine. It's in-canon busy work done under the guise of building trust with the Insular Nation, and the Sons don't involve themselves in the story for most of Heavensward's runtime. It's fortunate then that the busy work is slightly more enjoyable this time around. The areas in A Realm Reborn were varied enough and hit the points you'd want for a well-rounded fantasy world, but were fairly stereotypical as a result. The presence of these forced Heavensward to get more creative with its new zones. Many areas are situated on floating islands, and there's even a good variety among them. Some are sunny and welcoming, while others are barren and imposing. They also serve as the home of the dragons, featuring architecture similar to Ishgard but in a state of ruins. The wondrous architecture is even more abundant in the abandoned land of Sharlayan, a place much talked about but never previously seen, and the birthplace of Alphinaud. The buildings are full of sophistication one could expect from a land of scholars, even in its rundown state. The developers must have been proud of their world design work, because some gameplay changes make sure you will take it in. The post-game of A Realm Reborn granted the power of flight, making questing as convenient as possible with the side effect of making the world less engaging and immersive. Hardly a downside when the player's already spent hours exploring these areas, but could lead to any new areas having a less lasting impression. In order to avoid this, the new zones implement a few changes to exploration. For starters, flight's disabled, at least at first. The number of aetherites in each area is reduced, mostly replaced with the new ether currents. These ether currents are scattered all over the maps, and finding and collecting them will improve mount speed. Collecting all the ether currents in an area will allow flight in that area. They encourage more thorough exploration of the land, and seem to be inspired by the world design of lots of single-player open-world games. I see the appeal from a design and player perspective, and I did learn each area more as a result of their inclusion, but they also mean that players will have to take the time to find every collectible in every new zone if they want to be able to travel at the speed they've become accustomed to. The slower pace of travel would risk grading as much as it did in A Realm Reborn if it shared that base game's pacing. Luckily, it doesn't. The opening quest chains are short enough, especially if the player is learning a new class while doing them. One of the best features that Final Fantasy XIV has over other MMOs is the ability for every character to switch to any class whenever they want. Find the DPS isn't quite what you wanted, try switching to a tank. All you need to do is play through the job's quest chain and it's available on your character forever. This is the change I decided to make between expansions. The wait times I had for dungeons playing as a DPS class were not ideal, and I wanted to see what the new jobs added in Heavensward had to offer. After seeing so many people talk about the quality of the Dark Knight's questline, that's the class I went for. I could not be more happy with my decision. When starting out, I had assumed a DPS class would have the most options and be the best fit for a solo player. After playing the Dark Knight, I can say with certainty that any players whose primary concern is playing alone should pick a tank class. I can't speak to the moment-to-moment gameplay of every tank class, but the Dark Knight at least had even more attack options and elements to keep track of than the DPS class I chose of Dragoon. Tank gameplay in general is more engaging as well. As a DPS, I really did more than stand in place and perform my rotation, occasionally engaging with specific boss mechanics. As a tank, I was constantly at the head of the pack, making sure I was keeping enemies off my allies while dishing out single target damage or area of effect damage as required. Tanking also has a wonderful effect on the feeling of simulating a single-player game. Since your primary job is to keep enemies' eyes on you, they'll always be fully engaged with your character, not the rest of your party. It goes a long way to selling the idea that you are the main character, and the players you're grouped with are simply your party members. Not to mention the queue times, which are rarely longer than a few minutes. The downside to switching jobs is the need to grind their experience and play the new jobs quests. This is a downside I didn't feel, because the Dark Knight's questline might just be the best narrative content I've played in 14 so far. It starts off with a bit more intrigue than simply joining a job guild. A knight clad in black is killed in the streets by the religious temple knights of Ishgard, and the player sees where they dumped the body. Upon inspecting it, they find that the knight is not, in fact, dead. This Dark Knight, Frey, then takes the player under their wing to train them how to harness the darkness inside. What follows is a series of the exact kind of repetitive quests helping random villagers that RPGs are routinely mocked for. A pattern that Frey acknowledges, constantly urging the player to realize they can't help every single person and need to say no when someone asks for help. The circumstances in which the Dark Knight training is interrupted by people the players helped before becomes more and more ridiculous, culminating in a massacre of beastmen to recover some boxes for a random merchant. When the Dark Knight returns to the merchant, he complains that the wares are soaked in blood and demands the player pays him for the damages. The idea that a hero can't save everyone isn't as novel as it once was, but the quest chain also serves as a commentary on completionism and bloat in games. Frey's disdain for these fruitless excursions poses him as a stand-in for the players who groan at the thought of doing anything other than the main quest, players like me, while the player character is any player who takes in as much of a game as they can. An interesting angle for an optional MMO quest chain, but it's hardly the first time a game has made the player do something annoying to show them how annoying games can be. No. What really makes a Dark Knight quest chain special is the finale. The Temple Knights of Ishgard have caught wind of the fact the player's been training in dark arts. Despite the fact that they saved Ishgard and the whole world on multiple occasions, the Temple Knights still want to arrest them. The player goes to one of Ishgard's forts to meet with their allies and talk some sense into them, only to find dozens of knights on the ground and Frey at the center. Finally consumed by darkness, Frey reveals that they are not Frey. Frey died when they were attacked by the Temple Knights at the start of the quests. The being the player knows as Frey is, in truth, the player character themselves. Specifically, a manifestation of the player character's anger and disdain at the ungratefulness of the people of Eorzea. After saving the land from primals and the Empire, helping anyone in need, they're still tasked with more and more with no reward. The betrayal at the banquet in Ul'dah was the final straw, showing them that even being the hero of light, Paragon of Hope wasn't anything that a simple accusation from a scheming politician couldn't undo. The player must then fight Frey, now called Esteem, as they physically wrestle control of the darkness inside of them. Created player characters in games are infamous for being blank slates that lack any depth or distinct features of their own, and MMOs especially rarely offer any characterization past being the chosen one. The Dark Knight's questline forces the player character in Final Fantasy XIV to have internal struggles and complicated emotions that reflect the circumstances they've been through. It's a bold narrative choice for any game to put that on a player-created character, and it's a sign that 14 has really put an immense focus on creating a breathing world with characters that shift and react to it. The Dark Knight class is elevated even higher due to how well it interacts with the main story of Heavensward. It'd be easy to boil down the narrative's main theme to violence begets violence, but the specific ways it tackles the justifications for violence, benefits of conflict, and the difficulty of foregoing revenge while using the unique opportunities the fantasy setting affords it means that any simple reduction does the story an immense disservice. As suggested by the lead-up in A Realm Reborn's postgame, Heavensward primarily concerns the generations-long war between the Ishgardians and the Dragons. According to the Holy See, the religion that serves as Ishgard's leaders, the Dragons have plagued Ishgard for thousands of years, attempting to wipe them out and take over the land. A believable story that places Ishgard as the virtuous underdogs simply protecting their land, and places the faction led by Ysael as heretics and traitors for looking to broker peace between the two peoples. The reason Ysael is fighting for that peace, however, is because the Holy See's version of history is a lie. When the Ishgardians first came to the land thousands of years ago, the dragons were already there. They fought overland until a dragon, Hraesvelgr, and an elf, Shiva, fell in love. This relationship became a symbol of peace between the two races, and they lived in peace for a while. However, some Ishgardians became jealous of the dragon's power, and stole the eyes of Ratatosk, the sister of Nidhogg. This greedy betrayal is what began the Dragonsong War. As the generations passed, the elves forgot the truth of the history, and the Holy See crafted a story to take the blame away from Ishgard. After thousands of years, the betrayal of their forefathers erased from history, the Ishgardians could only see the dragons as aggressors. The only possible explanation for their attacks was that they were evil. But to the dragons, who themselves lived for thousands of years, the betrayal is still within a single lifetime. The killing of Ratatosk wasn't an event between people long gone, it was the murder of the living Nidhogg's sister. The irreconcilable differences in perspective fuel an endless war, a set of circumstances that this fantasy world can illustrate in ways a real-world setting never could. Once the truth is known, it's hard to see Ishgard as anything but the villains. But they're also your allies and friends, so there has to be a specific faction to take the blame. That faction is the Holy See. Since they have the real power in Ishgard, the nation's reclusive nature and overzealous temple knights tip off that whoever's running the place might not be concerned for what's best for the people. Their false history not only shirks Ishgard's responsibility, but also keeps it in an eternal war. A situation that the Holy See perpetuates to maintain control. If the people have a scapegoat, a villain, they'll be too busy focusing on that to challenge authority. Archbishop Thordan VII is the man in charge, and it's quickly made clear that he can't be trusted. His first appearance shows him talking with an Astinian, a faction that essentially serves as evil manifest. Alphino and the player try not to ruffle any of his feathers, but Sir Aymeric, the commander of the Temple Knights and the group's closest ally in Ishgard, makes it clear that he has more than a few issues with how Thordan's running things. Aymeric, then, must be Ishgard's good guy. His first impressions are that of a strictly loyal warrior, following code and procedure above all else. In reality, he's nearly the opposite. He resents much of Ishgard's policies, yearning for his home to open its borders again, and doing everything within his power to help the Scions prior to Heavensward. He does still strive to be a model knight, however, and generally chooses to affect the system how he can from inside it, rather than stir the pot too much. A later reveal that he's actually Archbishop Thordan's bastard son, and that he worked up to his station despite poor reputation that status earned him, solidified that he's truly a man of honor and integrity. Another of Edmond de Fortomp's sons, Archifont, is much like Sir Aymeric. He holds much the same values as Aymeric, but he has less power to effect change due to his lower station. His primary distinction is that he's the player's first friend in Ishgard, introduced all the way back when Ishgard first opens up in A Realm Reborn. This sentimental attachment and overlap in narrative function with Aymeric is likely why he's the member of the group to die a tragic death at the climax of Heavenward's second act. It's a death much like that of Agent Coulson in the Avengers. He was disposable enough to kill without changing the story, but likable enough for his loss to still affect the audience. His death at the hand of the Heavensward, the elite knights of the Holy Sea's inner circle, is the point of no return for the Holy See. From this moment on, there's no question who the enemy is. I'll take a break from discussing the story, but only because the game does too. For all of Heavensward's improvements and strengths, it's not without its share of annoyances. Final Fantasy XIV puts an impressive amount of focus on its story for an MMO, but it simply has to offer everything MMO players expect. There needs to be enough dungeons and boss fights for the players whose primary interest is multiplayer content. Heavensward offers plenty of this in its story, but there are a few spots in which quests deviate from the narrative to deal with what are, in hindsight, arbitrary roadblocks. Dealing with the Nath and their primal Ravana is simply padding before being granted access to the Dravanian homeland. Likewise with the Vanu Vanu and their primal Bismarck, a series of quests that only really serve to create space between the major story beats. To Heavensward's credit, though, even these slowdowns aren't without merit. The Nath subplot gives time for Ysayle, Astinian, and Alphino to build as a party and grow as characters, and the fights against Ravana and Bismarck are better than anything offered in A Realm Reborn. That time for the characters to build is appreciated, since one of A Realm Reborn's biggest flaws was that the Scions did a poor job of replicating the feeling of a JRPG party. That feeling is offered in a few ways in Heavensward, the first of which is the aforementioned group of Ysayle, Astinian, and Alphino. It's a tried and true setup of two people with irreconcilable differences, and one person in the middle trying to make them get along. Ysayle was introduced as Iceheart near the end of A Realm Reborn, and the turn she made from seeming central antagonist to staunch ally is enjoyable and well done. Her motivation for attacking Ishgard was a desire to bring peace between the elves and the dragons, a goal shared by all the good guys once the true history of Ishgard is learned. While other, similar characters could be consumed by their goals, Ysayle is more than willing to join the player as a peaceful alternative to further assaults in the city. Being on the right side of history would be enough to redeem her, but the deaths she caused along the way seemed to bother her more than anyone else. As such, it doesn't come as much of a surprise that she's the one to sacrifice herself to save the day near the end of Heavensward. A surefire way to end a redemption arc. The opposite side of the squabble in the group is Astinian, Ishgard's Azure Dragoon. He's a character that first appeared in the Dragoon questline, and my meeting him due to choosing that class in A Realm Reborn is another happy accident that enhanced Heavensward main story. In that questline, he's portrayed as an agent of revenge on the verge of losing control of his powers, excellent foreshadowing of his fate in the climax that's entirely optional. He's equally single-minded in Heavensward, only joining the player's quest for diplomacy and hope that he can kill Nidhogg when things go south. The most static of the group, his goals and views don't budge much until after the credits roll, though he does warm up to Ysayle as Ishgard's wrongdoings are brought to light. Astinian is the personification of Ishgard's desire for revenge, much as Nidhogg is the same for the Dravanians. It only makes sense that the two merge together at the end, serving as the final obstacle for both races to band together and move past their bloody, endless cycle. The man left in the middle is Alphino, Final Fantasy XIV's standout character. He continues his role as de facto protagonist, doing the talking for the silent player character. The base game saw him humbling himself, his self-image going from a savior of the realm to collaborator for good. Unfortunately, it seems he still wasn't quite humble enough. The Crystal Braves, his private military to solve all of the realm's problems, turned on him and fell apart, his right-hand man being an instrumental part of the assassination of the Sultana. Pair this with the loss of the other Scions, and Alphino's self-esteem is left at an all-time low for Heavensward. He knows something must be done to save the Scions and clear their name, but he's terrified that any further action on his part will make things worse. The hope for Dravanian diplomacy, and kind words from Tataru, are able to get him to take action again. Getting to know Ysayle and Astinian, two people who are also doing what they can to help the world despite all their flaws and mistakes, is what brings him back to his normal self. By the end of Heavensward, Alphino is confident enough to get things done, yet humble enough to know his shortcomings. Ever hopeful for the future, while realizing it can never be perfect. If I had to choose one thing I'm looking forward to in the next expansion, it's seeing how Alphino grows from here. Of the several issues in my video on A Realm Reborn, I regret none more than my neglecting to mention Tataru. I had pegged her as a one-note character who was essentially the mascot of the Scions, but quests late into the patches of Realm Reborn and her role in Heavensward show that she's every bit an essential member of the group as anyone else. Those late quests follow her as she trains to be a fighter, so that she can contribute to the group in a more tangible way. Her failure at this task doesn't shake her resolve to improve, gaining a renewed passion for her unique aptitude for information gathering and communication. After the disappearance of most of the Scions, she takes initiative at a time when even the confident and capable Alphino is on the verge of a breakdown. She spends Heavensward in the rough and tough bar of the Forgotten Night, keeping her ear to the ground and gathering all kinds of information that is instrumental to the player's success. Whenever the situation in Ishgard stabilizes, she's always the one to take the initiative in locating her friends, all the while maintaining her reputation as the cute and charming little sibling of the Scions. I'll make sure to give Tataru her due from now on. There's one flaw that is more of a mark against the game than some simple pacing issues, and it stands out so much because it's Heavensward's one regression into A Realm Reborn's main frustration: untapped potential. The banquet in Ul'dah that ends A Realm Reborn's patches was an incredible twist of fate that changed every facet of the story. Questions of what will happen after such an event stick in the back of the player's mind as they deal with the situation in Ishgard. Unfortunately, Heavensward walked back the most interesting consequence of the banquet. The Sultana's death and the disappearance of Ul'dah's military leader was something that would irrevocably change Ul'dah's government, possibly sending it to a state of civil war. That is, if the Sultana actually died. By the midpoint of Heavensward, the Sultana is found to be alive, Rauban is reinstated as general, and the two of them are forced to keep the whole event a secret so that nothing in Ul'dah changes at all. I suppose that adding a civil war in Ul'dah might be hard to balance as a writer while Ishgard's facing a similar situation, but positioning the event as the final thing before Heavensward seemed to promise that the player would have to manage these complex situations across Eorzea at the same time. Ishgard's near-civil war in the post-game seems to be an acknowledgement of the opportunity the writers turned away from. The inevitable resistance to change and unaddressed anger of the commoners are the natural cost the nation must pay if they want to enact real change. The conversation between Aymeric and the Sultana even draws a direct parallel between the situation in the two city-states, with Ishgard's trouble showing the Sultana what could have happened if she actually was assassinated, or what might happen if she goes through with her plan of turning Ul'dah into a democracy. I appreciate that the writers were able to make something out of their return to the status quo in Ul'dah, but I would prefer it if they just rolled with what they'd set up. I'm sure the situation in Ul'dah evolves in later expansions, but I can only judge based on what I've seen. I was worried that Midgardsormr's severing of the tie between the player character and Hydaelyn would similarly be walked back with no consequence. The connection's re-established by the end of the main quest, and the power of the Echo isn't gone long enough to affect much, not to mention that the repeat of the Crystal Awakenings from A Realm Reborn feel arbitrary. It's as if the crystals seem to know that the plot advanced and turned back on themselves. Once it's all said and done, though, it's revealed that Hydaelyn has lost nearly all of its power, using its last bits of energy to connect with the player again and save Minfilia. This is a plot revelation that doesn't pertain much to Heavensward specifically, but could be the crux of the plot down the line. A consequence that did stick is the fate of the Scions of the Seventh Dawn. The core members are unaccounted for the entirety of the main story quests, with the exception of Y'shtola near the very end. The postgame spends a lot of time gathering the rest, and seeing what changes these characters underwent was always refreshing when compared to their appearances in A Realm Reborn. The perilous escape from Ul'dah left each of the Scions with some kind of scar, some physical, some mental, some ethereal. Y'shtola, the first Scion rescued, managed to escape through the use of the Forbidden Flow spell that allowed her to teleport by merging with the lifestream. Recovering her required equally obscure magic, and those that come back from the spell unscathed are very few. Exactly what happened to Y'shtola is unclear, but one thing that's for sure is that her eyes have changed color. A detail attentive players may assume was some kind of byproduct of her new design in Heavensward, but when a character draws attention to it a few hours later, it confirms that something went wrong in her rescue. It's likely that she is now blind, or at least her vision is impaired or altered in some way. The fact that she calls no attention to this change and remains as confident and capable as ever is a testament to the maturity and willpower that made her the standout Scion in A Realm Reborn. Thyncred was also caught in Y'shtola's flow spell, and has similarly been impaired in some way. Prior to the banquet, Thyncred was the dashing rogue of the group, always ready with a quip, slinging blades and spells alike. He clearly has some darkness within him, but he tries to hide it. The side effects of flow severed Thyncred's connection to magic, not only depriving him of much of his battle capabilities, but leaving him unable to attune to aetheryte to quickly travel across the land. This seems to barely bother him in comparison to the loss of Minfilia, the one person he truly sought to protect. Thyncred in Heavensward has dropped most of his roguish charm in the wake of all that he has lost, trading it in for a brooding, redemptive persona drenched in regret. Minfilia seems to be all but lost, having merged with Hydaelyn to save both of their lives. She's now the word of the mother, Hydaelyn being too weak to speak for herself. The story seems to be suggesting that she's truly gone, but in fantasy stories like this, deaths that stick tend to be more definitive than the state of limbo that Minfilia is in. Despite feeling that they were more caricatures than characters in A Realm Reborn, I was really happy to see all the Scions again. The hardships each of them endured following the betrayal of the Crystal Braves reinforced the traits that made them stand out amongst the group, from Y'shtola's resilience to Ida's hot-headedness. Seeing the actions these characters take in response to truly difficult situations shows a side of them that conversation simply never could, making them feel multifaceted, feel like people. If Final Fantasy XIV had an issue with creating memorable characters before, it definitely does not now. The dungeons and bosses have become much more memorable too. The game already had a number of highlights in this department, but Heavensward really steps things up. The base game had to start off small, so a decent amount of the dungeons are somewhat bland caves or crypts. Now 14 is free to get a little more inventive with its dungeon theming. Highlights include a prison break, a techno factory, and my personal favorite, the Great Google Library. The enemy designs here are wildly creative, many of them spawning from, or simply being, books. Its soundtrack is equally memorable, with a loose, dissonant jazz that glitches and flares up to a confident rhythm in combat. It pairs well with the increased complexity of the encounter design. The MMO boss gimmicks are now out in full force, including near one-hit kills, mid-fight puzzles, and increasingly expressive attack patterns. It can be quite fun, but playing a tank with the more full kit and more demanding bosses can also be a little stressful. Final Fantasy XIV does an incredible job of making an MMO controller-friendly, but keeping track of all the button combinations for different abilities can overwhelm in the heat of the moment. I personally also have issues quickly switching which enemy I'm targeting, since the D-pad lacks the precision a simple mouse click could provide. Time and practice are really all that's needed to get around these issues though, so Heavensward clearly offers better dungeon experiences. The Techno Factory I mentioned earlier is in the flying Allagan city of Azure. The Allagans continue to be a mysterious source of power from the past, first granting the Empire the ultimate weapon, and now granting the Holy See the futuristic marvel that is Azure. The Empire bases previously encountered already add a good deal of sci-fi to the setting, but the Lost Allagan city takes it even further. Neon lights run through gold-plated floors and walls, biological experiments roam the rocks, and AI drones guide the hero. It feels sufficiently alien to anything else in the game. Just seeing the place makes one understand why both the Empire and the Holy See want control of it. The final dungeon in Azure is home to the most prominent appearance of the Scions. They play an identical role as they did in A Realm Reborn, lurking in the shadows as a vague threat, only becoming directly confrontational at the very end. Not much more can be said about them, really, though the boss fight against a duo of them was a welcome surprise. Once Thordan and the Heavensward transformed into legendary knights, something that should have been easy to guess is now plain to see. The concept of the Primals has mostly been an excuse to fight the famous summons of the Final Fantasy series. Of course the final boss of Heavensward was going to be Knights of the Round. A visual spectacle in its own merit, a quick comparison of this fight to the original summon from Final Fantasy VII shows that this is by far the best attempt at creating a boss battle against the Final Fantasy summon so far. The order of knights, the attacks and patterns they use, and of course the glass shatter and teleport to space. Everything from that decades-old cutscene is here. Even if you don't know the reference, it's an exhilarating conclusion to the story. This is only the end of the launch version of Heavensward though. Just as before, there are several patches between the expansions that tie up loose ends and set up what comes next. The patches grant a storytelling opportunity that's really rare in gaming. Each patch can be seen as something akin to a television episode, allowing for some shorter, more focused quest chains that start and resolve in satisfying ways. Patches also convey a sense of time passing in the real world. In many ways, the story of Final Fantasy XIV plays out in real time, with characters acknowledging the time that passes between each patch. I don't think I've seen this effect in other game genres, and it's a strength of MMOs I've never considered before. The first 3 patches are an extended epilogue to Heavensward, showing the consequences of the ending and giving closure to character arcs that were left hanging. A surprising example of this is when the lazy, womanizing Fortomp son Amon Lane is forced to make a critical decision under immense pressure, and then forcing him to stop pitying himself after he makes the wrong choice. He's a character that's introduced right at the beginning and then ignored, so I really appreciated that the time spent characterizing him wasn't wasted. I mentioned the Commoner uprising against peace with Dravanians before, but the parallel stories of this rebellion with the return of Nidhogg show that it's hard to make big decisions for large groups of people and have everyone agree with the choice. The quest to save Astinian gives closure to both his and Alphinaud's character arcs. Astinian finally letting go of his hatred, and Alphinaud gaining the resolve to save his friends, no matter how dire the circumstances. The third patch ends with some final narration from Edmont, as he literally closes the book on Heavensward. Patch 4 centers on the Warriors of Darkness, one of the most fascinating concepts introduced so far. They're a group of travelers from a parallel dimension, mirroring the players, who come to this world to save their own. In their world, they destroyed the Scions, and banished the darkness, leaving nothing but light. They soon found out that light isn't what the world needs, balance is, as their dimension was washed away in pure light. When given the chance to come to Eorzea by an Ascian, they resolve to sacrifice this new realm to bring balance back to their own. If the game happened to be from their perspective, the Warriors of Darkness would simply be heroes faced with a tough choice. Exploring this new aspect to the setting is great in itself, but it's paired with the amazing payoff to the slowly building suspense surrounding Urianger. Since the end of A Realm Reborn, he's been shown conversing with Ascians, and his true intentions have never been clear. Outside of these few scenes, he's a very minor character in the Scions, making him even more mysterious. It seemed impossible for him not to be a traitor, but at the last moment, he reveals himself to be the orchestrator behind many important events, all in the name of helping the most people possible. He did guide the Warriors of Darkness, but only because he knew of a way to save their whole realm. Urianger sees his longtime deceit as unforgivable, but no one else seems to mind much since he did so much good. I didn't expect his plot to resolve this early in Final Fantasy XIV, but it was incredibly satisfying to learn that this background character was pulling his weight the whole time. The setup for Stormblood is more rushed than the setup for Heavensward, and doesn't leave as much of an impact as the Banquet. Then again, what could? An attempt to have the same amount of impact is made, and they get closer to it than I would expect. The final Scions, Papalymo and Ida, are found late in the patches and quickly factor into their finale. Naturally, that means they're also the last to get the level of development the other Scions received. Not much time is left before Stormblood, so it's quickly revealed that Ida was born in the conquered land of Alamigo, and is therefore naturally interested in their recent movements to free it by a radical group of refugees. What could be a good cause turns sour when the Scions learn that this group plans to free Alamigo by forcing the Eorzean alliance into war with the Empire, as well as summoning a primal equal in power to the one that caused the calamity. The Scions learn this too late, and the plan is put into action. They arrive at the scene just as the primal is being summoned. With little time left and few options available, Papalymo decided that he had to use the same spell Louis Sois used to seal away Bahamut during the calamity. Doing so costs him his life, leaving Ida without a mentor. He takes the loss of Papalymo harder than anyone, but his passing also gives her the resolve to finally be herself. Ida reveals that her true name is actually Lys. Ida was her older sister who died some years ago. She took her older sister's place in the Scions when she learned of her passing. This whole sequence is a lot to take in for how quickly it's presented, leaving the player with a feeling of equal parts sorrow, determination, and exhaustion. Nevertheless, Papalymo's sacrifice is quite sad, both because of how much he meant to Ida and the fact that he never got to show much of himself as a character before he went. Stormblood is primed to feature an all-out war on both Eorzean and Garlean soil, certainly an exciting story hook, but whereas the lead-up to Heavensward left me with no clue what would happen next, I have a good idea what to expect in the next expansion. So many story threads still remain to be explored. Zodiark, the Ascians, the Empire. With all the potential left, you'd think that Heavensward must not have tackled enough, but that is so far from the case. Heavensward is the promise A Realm Reborn made. A sprawling story full of complex moral and philosophical threads that are constantly intertwining and playing off of each other, with a rich cast of characters that grow and change alongside the world they live in. A game pulling off this story is an achievement. The fact it can do that while also being a world for players to live in and play together is a miracle. I hope you enjoyed the video as much as I enjoyed Heavensward. I am now past the free trial, which includes the entirety of A Realm Reborn and the award-winning Heavensward expansion up to level 60 with no restrictions on playtime, so I'll have to actually pay money for this game and tackle the next expansion, Stormblood. Thanks for watching.
Echoes of truths that once rang clear.